Now, before we embark upon this very important subject, it's always dependent upon your previous convictions. If, for instance, you have no real conviction that you are spirit here and now, that you cannot die, nothing that I say will make the slightest sense. So if you are still in this area of inquiry, will you just, for the sake of our discussion together this evening, presume that yes, indeed, you do believe that you are spirit here and now and that you cannot die, whether your physical body is no longer of any use to you, then your inner self, your spiritual self, goes on to another level of consciousness. But here, of course, we come into this somewhat complicated area of development and spiritual progress, because your attitude of mind at your time of death is the entry into your state of consciousness, your spiritual consciousness, when you awaken. There is no contradiction or doubt about the fact that you are going to awaken, but you could quite easily, in that awakening, depending upon your previous knowledge and understanding, not realize that you are indeed in a different sphere of consciousness. You will be exactly the same as you were a few moments before you closed your eyes in death. Now, quite obviously then, your state of mind in these circumstances heralds the kind of experience into which you are going to enter. Let us take very briefly here somebody that has been hurled into spirit by way of an accident. This, of course, provides no preparation at all on the conscious level for any such entry into the spirit world. So you come into, in these circumstances, frequently, your state of mind is complete surprise that you knew you'd been knocked down by that car or somebody had shot you, but you feel exactly the same, and miraculously, you would say of yourself, I'm completely unhurt. So this, again, this state of consciousness is a very important factor in your awakening after death. You will expect, more or less, the same degree of experience that was prevalent just prior to your demise. If you have been ill for a long time, you have accustomed yourself to hospital treatment, hospital visitors, and so on. You would be still in that state of consciousness. You would be still in your hospital bed because your thoughts would have promoted that state of consciousness. Let me just explain a little about this state of thought. Everything to do with what we call the astral level. If I can just say, everything, of course, you know, is governed by that vibratory note. And the astral level is the slowest note, or nearest note, to the earthly plane. You can move in and out on the astral level, and you would have the same degree of physical recognition on that level. Everything around you will look totally familiar on the physical plane by which you recollect it. So this astral level of entry is the inevitable entry for all such souls passing in death. There's no, exception to that. The exception or variation arises when the awakening soul is, so to speak, unprepared. Now, the spiritually enlightened person will very quickly recognize, because by way of meditation, by way of prayer, by way of spiritual understanding and spiritual directive to the conscious level of their particular walk in life and experiences through which they've passed, this would happen very, very quickly, and they would therefore throw off quite rapidly what we call the physical uniform or mechanism. But of course, there are those now who are, so to speak, imprisoned by earthly conditions, by way of suffering, by way of wrongdoing, by way of all kinds of areas, let's call them of discord, things contrary to spiritual purpose and spiritual harmony. And it includes illness, and it includes all these various aspects of what I'm going to term imprisonment, because the area of healing in the spiritual sense is a liberation from your self-imposed prison. Everything that you suffer in the spirit world, you have attracted to yourself. So that if you have sought refuge in areas, we'll say, of hypochondriac, areas of illnesses of one form or another, you have taken such care of yourself physically, you are so afraid of having this happen to you and that happen to you, you would carry this same fear of attack on your well-being into the world of spirit. It wouldn't change. You would not be convinced that you can be immediately cured, you can be immediately helped. This is one category, and this is not the most difficult for us to help, but it is the most, may I say, unpredictable. Because you see, a great deal of this kind of hypochondriac fear is wholly concerned with the physical body. And the spirit has, whilst in the body, been imprisoned by this kind of negative limitation. But the spirit itself now is free. And again, according to the degree of the spiritual development of that individual, so this liberation could be very, very expedient in that it could be left behind a great deal on the physical level of emotional intrusion rather than true spiritual impediment. I'm sorry, there's no simple way to describe spiritual activity in physical language, because you see, you have no real parallel on the physical level. Everything on the physical level has its beginning, its middle, and its end. It has the, the solidarity. You can touch it, you can see it. If it's not there, then you can't see it, so you don't know about it. You are limited on all these levels, which are totally absent on a spiritual level of consciousness. You sometimes wonder why this or that or the other loved one hasn't come back in a clairvoyant message, for instance, when your own loving thoughts have been spontaneously, simultaneously united with that loved one. You can't think of anyone in the spirit world unless they are thinking of you. You are immediately identified with any thought degree in any direction to which your thought is directed. So you see, your calculations on a physical level are extremely inhibited if you think about it on a level of spiritual experience. There's quite a lot of, let's call it collectively, ifs and buts about it. But bearing that in mind and emphasizing that it is totally dependent upon the spiritual state, and that's the operative word, the spiritual state of consciousness. Because you see, a great deal of your physical behavior has nothing to do with your spiritual point of progression at all. It can be brought about by physical limitations, by physical exhaustion, and all kinds of things pertaining to the physical experiences through which you are passing, and in which your spirit is powerless to intervene unless you seek refuge in the inner temple that we've talked about so often of spiritual communion. This is what prayer and meditation is all about. And in prayer and meditation, your spirit receives the necessary strength to overcome these emotional and very often frustrating experiences that you register on a physical level as insurmountable. So you must then bear in mind that your state of spiritual progression is a very important factor in this area. Now, accepting that, and accepting that it could qualify these examples that I'm going to try and relate to you, I want you to, may I say, make allowances for this perhaps variation of the outcome of perhaps somebody whom you know and love, and you could be thinking about them in these terms. It's not necessarily exactly the way I'm going to portray, because the way I portray it will be dependent upon my imagined state of consciousness in which they departed. Now, that's very important to you. It would be the state of consciousness in which they have departed. Now, we've already talked about the accident. Let's just deal with that briefly, because as I've said, more often than not, the accidental death, totally unprepared, is extremely baffled by the fact that they are unhurt. That's their first reaction. And then they are looking around, and they will see, again, according to the circumstances, they will see the various activity, perhaps people standing over what they see to their utter amazement, a replica of themselves, in fact, their body. Again, according to their understanding, they would jump to conclusions. But to the degree, again, of the completely uninitiated, the person who has no idea that this is likely to happen, there are always those bands of spiritual helpers, just as you have bands of healers on the earth plane. So we have bands of spiritual beings who deliberately occupy an astral experience, spiritual experience, so that they are there to conduct various people as they leave the body and conduct them to their spiritual homes one way and another. And just as your healing is in groups of, let's call it, kinds of need, so too do we. We come into those groups. Any earthquake, any overall calamity where there is intense fear, explosions of one kind or another, these demand a special kind of ministration, because they now, whilst again, just like the accident, are hurled into spirit. The fear, as it were, is the major concern, the major emotion which they take with them. So healing on this level, therefore, would be first of all to soothe or to try to smooth away their fear. And while the way we do this, again, according to the consciousness of those who have been hurled, in this case, into spirit, the way we do this, we form a circle, a huge circle, and we spiritually radiate light and color, and we direct it towards the emotional upheaval that is the foundation of the fear. And we gradually, rather like a gentle massage, the fear, if I can give you a kind of example, would register as a great, enormous black cloud. And we would direct this collective color. Now the collective color is based on the collective vibratory note of the group for whom we are responsible. We may take this little corner of the disaster, say 6 or 8 such persons, and these are they now who have this orchestration of vibratory need. When I say that, some vibrations are a little faster, slower, and so on. So we bring now that group and we augment it. And we now focus our collective augmentation of collective color into that area of black fear. And gradually we see that black cloud dispersing. And gradually the individuals who haven't really known what was happening to them at all begin to, may I say, pull themselves together. And they are not yet accustomed to the spontaneity of thought, but they find themselves aware of what we are saying to them without necessarily recognizing how they know what we are saying to them. They are able to understand without depending upon the phraseology to which they are accustomed on the earth plane. And a sense of what we are saying to them begins, as this fear disperses, begins now to register spirit to spirit. And again, according to their level of understanding, and that too would be included in this augmentation, this orchestration of their vibration. So we would continue to gently explain what has happened to you. And one by one, according again to their personal realization, we would be able, on the one hand, to help them to what we call a place of rest. On the other hand, those who were ready would be delighted to see certain loved ones who have preceded them into the spirit world waiting to take them. This must definitely depend upon their own, again, conscious awareness. But let's come back to those who have no idea, and I've said we take them to a rest home. Now here, our conversation by thought, that they would interpret as language because they're not yet familiar with the spontaneity of thought, we would say to them, you haven't been hurt, but you need a rest. We are going to take you now to a place of rest where you are going to be able to sleep peaceably and recover, as it were, from your shock. And what that means, we don't attempt at this stage to tell them that they have died. We do not attempt to explain whom we are. We let them think that we are workers of one form or another. Their conscious mind is reasonably familiar with Red Cross and St. John's Ambulance and people in such disasters who are always present on the earth plane when such disasters occur. So that it is quite now acceptable for them to know that they are being ministered to in this way. Now that's that area. And they would, on this level, again, by the same focusing of spiritual light and love, we are able to put them into a sleep, a spiritual. I suppose the nearest again would be to your meditation, because in meditation you are indeed spiritually, you are not asleep in the accepted sense, but you are totally inactive on a spiritual level because you are in a state of receptivity in your meditation. Your spirit is passive and opening itself up to all the thought waves and the spiritual renewal that meditation demands. So it's as nearly a parallel as I can get for you. There would be a state of unconsciousness, again to use a physical term. But it's not unconscious in its inactive sense. The spirit, you must understand, it's not, you see, unconscious in the physical sense means that the body is passive and the spirit is released. But in this case, of course, the spirit is there. So the spirit is, so to speak, anesthetized almost in its own inaction. It just lets go of its hold over physical participation in the effort that it quite obviously made whilst it was on the earth plane one way and another. It releases all the effort and it relaxes into this renewal, this spiritual renewal that, as I've said, I can only explain it in other way, like in this way, by way of parallel, a deep sleep. Now the spirit stays in that state of consciousness, but it stays within the focusing of this light, because once we focus those lights and emanations upon that spirit, it remains focused. It stays within that light. And this, again, in parallel to your own healing, is equivalent to you focusing your energy upon the patient. And subsequently, and a lot of you don't know this, a lot of you have no idea that because the patient isn't there, that your energy, your particular spiritual emanation that constitutes your healing is, so to speak, on tap to that spirit any time at all on behalf of the physical body that it is occupying. So by the same token then, although we're not standing round now, we are definitely still in touch with every soul whom we help in that way. Now that's one aspect. If you can classify that under the heading of disasters, the accident, as I've said, is a very different proposition, because here we have a single soul who's been, let's say, run over, and the effect of this, you see, is very much more physically positive. We can talk to them here. Again, we talk on this thought level, but they don't understand that it's not being spoken. And we can say, look, you have been in an accident. And again, according to the state of that spirit. Now that's very important, because the state of the spirit would be very dependent upon the kind of life that your physical consciousness had lived whilst the spirit was occupying your physical body. So again, dear ones, I can't differentiate in a particular detail. I can only generalize in this for you. But in the main, very quickly, such a person recognizes that whether they believe it or understand it or not, that they are unhurt. That's their major reaction, that they are unhurt. And first of all, there is the relief that that's a wonderful thing. And then gradually, again, we have to foster these thought waves to the degree or level of their capacity to receive them. So that's yet another aspect of healing, although it doesn't come into the category of healing the way you would define it, because here, I think perhaps its classification would come under the heading of counseling, trying to explain to this newly awakened spirit what has happened, and dismissing by so doing any conscious intrusion that in any way obstructed the spiritual progress. And usually in these circumstances, again, depending entirely upon the individual, the loved ones that have gone before, the people with whom they're familiar on a physical level, but they know perfectly well, have been passed on for quite some time, and so on. Gradually, this sort of consciousness percolates. Remember, everything on the thought level in spiritual terms is much more insidious. It's not so brutal as speech is. You see, when I say something to you, it hits your consciousness. Were I to think it to you, it would percolate very gently, and you would absorb it, and it would be interpolated with your own ideas and thoughts, you see. So it's got a totally different impact when you deal with it on a spiritual level. If you've had any kind of inner prompting within yourself, you know, it's rather like something that has trickled into your brain rather than somebody saying something to you positively. And of course, if you've actually heard a spirit voice, you've already transposed the thought into physical audibility. But the same degree of gentleness would even accompany that. It's quite different from physical speech, the way you understand it. So I think that covers that. I'm hoping to give you time for questions here, if I'm leaving you in any kind of confusion or doubt about these aspects. Now let's come to somebody, the one who has been, I'm going to say brutalized. I don't mean this in any physical sense. You know, there are many, many ways of brutalizing another spirit. You can take away somebody's confidence by sneering. You can take away somebody's well-being by constantly putting them down. You can really inflict daily torture upon somebody by your behavior to that person. And these are the most difficult areas of our healing, because again they are solely dependent upon the spiritual level. But in many cases, such brutality, and I'm not talking about physical brutality, you see, friends, although physical brutality is horrific, and of course you should be definitely horrified that should take place. I'm not in any way condoning that level, but I am saying quite definitely that you do not take physical brutality into the spirit world with you. Anybody that inflicts such kind of brutality upon you, that would be dependent upon the effect that it had upon your spirit as such. But this other insidious crucifying of your spirit in terms of, as I've said, sneering, putting you down, trying to negatize everything, every effort you may, you're never going to be any good at that, you know. I don't know what puts this in. Why don't you wake up to reality? You are ugly, you are useless. All these areas, these are the most difficult areas for us to heal spiritually, because they do damage the spirit. In your auric field, you have, as it were, a kind of covering. I'm sure those of you who've seen the aura pictured, you know the sort of thing from head to toe. It's a kind of cloak almost around you, from with about, I suppose, again depending upon your development, but let's say approximately 10 inches away from your body, going from your body to about a space of 10 inches. When you get this kind of brutality on the earth plane, it's not just your physical reaction. It is a definite intrusion into this auric field, and you have what we call auric damage. This is a special kind of, I was going to say illness, perhaps that's not the right word. Injury, that's better, injury. Because if you have healed such a person, trying to give them confidence, trying to help them on a purely physical level now, I mean, you know how repetitive. You cheer them up and so on, and then back they come to you, and it's back to square one. They still, oh no, That's what people think about me and so on. So it's the most heartbreaking area to heal on a purely physical level from any degree of being able to measure any kind of progress. And this is not the fault of either the spirit or the body as such. It is because the injury is what we call a vital injury. And if you can remember that the greatest harm you can do another person is to undermine their belief in themselves or undermine their self-confidence in any way, it's so painful when it happens, because it doesn't just damage that physical, again, all right, let's call it the ego. It really penetrates the aura. Now this makes little incisions into the aura. And in this, like cuts and wheels and so on. And in this area, therefore, of disturbance comes all the atmosphere, the harsh atmosphere of the world around, so that the damage is compounded, it increases, and so on. I'm exaggerating quite a lot here, dear one, because I want to tell you how this particular condition, as I've said, it's the most difficult to heal because of the spirit that has been, so to speak, crushed in this way. And it comes in all sorts of quite spectacular ways. Sometimes, for instance, with the bigoted and dogmatic father, the man who wouldn't allow his children to grow in their own individual way. That spirit, when that has been continued and carried on one way and another, has imprisoned the spirit, so they come over to us as if they are in chains. And we have to deal with that on one level. I'll deal with that in a moment. We have yet another aspect of as if I am without skin and as if I can't bear anything near me to touch me. So we deal with that in yet another way. And all these areas, therefore, have their own individual injuries. They're not injuries the way you understand it in the physical sense. And yet there's equivalent to the exposure that physical injuries would provide. For instance, if you were very, very badly burned, you would be absolutely in agony with the exposure that represented. So that's the kind of thing when I talk about exposure. If you have been chained, hand and foot, your arms laced to your chest, that would be the imprisonment to which I refer, and all the subsequent, again, discomfort that afforded, and so on. These are, of course, physical representations, but the real pain, dear ones, is in the physical, the spiritual sensitivity that provides. So, how do we deal with this? Well, now, first, we have to try and restore the confidence. The spirit is so subdued, it's so crushed, that it can't awaken to this. So, again, we use our sleep. We don't attempt to heal here. We gently put them all, as you would say, under an anesthetic. Now, as that takes effect, so we are able, you see, forgive me, I've got to diverse just a little bit here. You see, we can't send this light straight into that spiritual auric being, because the very protection, the chaining, the exposure, and everything denies them any accessibility. We can't get near them like that. They're too bruised, they're too broken. So it wouldn't be any use doing our light around them like that. We should have to wait now until they've been anesthetized. Now, when they're in this deep sleep, we can now, because the conscious awareness of the sensitivity of the spiritual pain has been, so to speak, put to sleep, rather like your anesthetic. Now, and here too, we have to be extremely careful. It's no use giving a full blast of spiritual energy and spiritual power while they are anesthetized. We have to very, very gently, rather the way you would gently massage or put ointment on a wound, very gently. And there are various areas of the aura that are, let us say, more damaged than others. Because even when you come here, you radiate your own auric personality. That's how you are recognized. You can be instantly recognized on the point of your own progression by the auric emanation that your spirit reveals. So by the same token, therefore, we are able to allocate these various areas of acute injury, acute damage, and we can separate that from the less damaged part. And as we so separate, we cover that very damaged part, and we focus very, very gently the light into the adjoining part of the aura that is undamaged at that particular point, and so on. This doesn't make a bit of sense to you on a physical level. I know that. You have no parallel. But you can understand how important it is to recognize that what you say with intent to hurt is far more damaging than hitting somebody with a stick or whatever injury you make or perform on them. So these then are these areas of really prolonged healing, and gradually we are able to restore them. We bring them back from time to time. We don't leave them in this state of amnesia all the time, because they have to gradually restore their own spiritual now equilibrium of consciousness. They've got to be restored to their own spiritual level of identity. And frequently this again is a temporary thing. And we have to measure as they awaken, we have to measure how advantageous. You must remember, with adjoining pockets of healthy auric emanation, we can inject and do, rather like a blood injection. We are able to restore the overall well-being. But in a way, paradoxical as this seems, the overall spiritual well-being, if we're not very, very careful, intensifies the sensitivity or the pain of the hurt, because now the spirit is becoming more and more aware of what that opposition, as it were, is denying them, so that you get a different area, not the same auric injury pain, but a different area of pain, that my spirit wasn't able to do what I wanted to do in this incarnation. And I know I could have done this, and I could have. Now we've got that area of pain, rather the way some of you are going to experience pain for a totally different, reason, because you will see when you come here and you get that review of your situation here, you will see those many opportunities that perhaps you didn't recognize, and there'll be that acute disappointment that you didn't avail yourself of that opportunity when it was there, because you didn't recognize it, because you were overwhelmed by physical conditions of one form or another. This is what incarnations are all about. So you don't need to waste any or deny yourself any sleep over that. But it's a similar kind of pain, of awakening, which again, we have to be extremely careful to minimize, because whilst this injury is still so painful, We don't want to take on too much of an additional pain, albeit a totally different kind of pain altogether. So you will see then a great deal of thought and love and power goes into these areas of spiritual healing and what that means. I don't think there's any other example that I can, illumine for you. Perhaps, yes, because you ask me questions about things from time to time. It's rather a knotty problem for you when you think about somebody, for instance, especially a little child that's been brutally murdered. And obviously, quite reasonably, you ask questions about this. Now, the first thing you've got to remember is that the child, while a child in the body, friend, is not a child in the spiritual sense. And almost invariably, in these horrific examples of physical brutality, and I would take a whole spectrum of that, they are almost invariably advanced spirits who have voluntarily undertaken to come and undergo that experience, to give the perpetrator of that the opportunity of overcoming whatever caused the brutality. The brutality itself is the outcome of something baser, something much more vitally destructive. But quite obviously, on the physical level, you can only measure the effect of the brutality, very properly be horrified by it. But in spiritual terms, friend, it is why somebody does something, not what they have done. So that in this kind of area of innocence and being subjected to this kind of brutality, there is the advanced spirit here who has offered the opportunity to the individual to either throw out whatever is causing this particular action and disperse it, or again, as in the case of the brutality, has succumbed, I beg your pardon, to whatever it was that caused it. This is very difficult for you to understand on a physical level, but I promise you that the spirit of the child is utterly untouched by this. It has absolutely nothing like what I was describing with the bruised and victimized spirit that I've just been trying to explain to you. This is an instantly liberated spirit, and again, all the brutality, all the horror of that is immediately shed, left behind, because this is the sole, again, advantage of some advanced spirit taking on this job or that job. So try to understand this, horrific as it is. I'm not in any way condoning any of these areas, dear ones, but I am saying to you, I can give you absolute assurance that the minute that little one is released from the body, the spirit is arisen, takes complete control, and knows that that particular job has been done as far as they were able so to do. Because you see, dear ones, in this area, while you only hear of the failures, there are countless examples of this, where the child may suffer a little privation, may suffer a little bit of inconvenience, but in the main, it's been successful in creating something in the heart of those with whom it associates. The burglar, the man who lives by his wits, has often been charmed by the heart of a child. So you see, there are these other aspects of administration which are equally important spiritually, over which, of course, you have no understanding or control on a physical level. But I promise you, and you've no need to be unduly unhappy about the future of that little one. They do not remain in terror or the pain that has been inflicted. That is shed instantly. The spirit is released from the body. But the exercise that has promoted it, dear ones, is directed towards why. What caused it? And here again you see you can trace it back to all sorts of persons involved in this or that. And they too come into this area of, let's call it, spiritual imprisonment. Now, we can't do anything for the people who had to redeem themselves in their own enlightenment. You cannot put anything right until you know what is wrong. And if those, let's call them those guilty ones, come into our world enshrouded by their own arrogance or their own greed or their own selfishness or sadism, we can't do anything about that. They have to be now surrounded by people of their own kind, and you've no idea how torturous that can be. I'm not going to talk about it because it's not relevant to what we're saying. But I do want to emphasize that a lot of things that take place on the earth plane, dear ones, if you knew what caused them, you would not be nearly as condemning in the what happened as a result of this or result of that, as again appears on the surface. It's very, very difficult, I know, on a physical level to condone this kind of action or that kind of action. But you see, in spiritual terms, dear one, and indeed this cuts both ways, because a lot of these self-righteous people are far less spiritually enlightened than those whom they condemn. It's what is in your heart, what is in your mind when you do this or you do that. Why do you do this? For what reason? And you've got to have, therefore, this spiritual impetus that promotes your action to make positive progress and use of this incarnation. Now, I don't think I can give you any other examples. You may wonder about the people who are disabled here, who are born disabled and so on. Again, the spirit is never disabled, never. So if you have then this poor helpless body who's never walked, who's never talked, and so on, again, reasonably, on that physical level, you say, what use, what purpose? But here again, you see, the spirit knows its own particular function. It knows its own purpose. And remember, we are not dealing with morality. We're not dealing with self-righteous, holier-than-thou situations. We are dealing with our capacity in progression to draw to ourselves a greater measure of divinity, whereby we can, as it were, draw closer to the God force, grow taller in our own spiritual growth. And this accommodates a great many activities that make no sense if we try to calculate them from physical equations and all that means. But in spiritual terms, the effect of that little helpless one, the loving kindness that it's promoted, the reformations that have been endeavored to try and, may I say, put this right, correct it, and so on. There are countless opportunities by disasters that awaken in the hearts of those concerned all kinds of ministrations that without that disaster, without that particular area of need, would never, never be able to express themselves on that level. So you have this interpenetration of spiritual endeavor, of spiritual purpose, that is the answer for so many things that you can't answer on a physical level of equation. But I promise you, dear ones, there is absolutely nothing to worry about from the spirit that somebody else brutalizes from their helplessness in this. But this persistent breaking down of the spirit, this persistent crucifying, this is the greatest damage anyone can do to another person. Because you see, the spirit is dependent upon the emotional impetus that it uses to promote whatever it is doing on the physical level to bring about its own growth. And with this constant crushing and bruising and pushing down, there is no capacity for this kind of expansion. And of course, it denies that spirit the opportunity for its own, again, growth. Again, you've got to come back, Yuan, to that area of spiritual growth. Quite obviously, if a spirit is more advanced than another spirit, it's going to countermand all this pressure. It's going to go on regardless. It's going to do it in spite of. And I'm not in any way contradicting any of that. But not all spirits are ready for that kind of emotion. Again, your thoughts may say, well, why? We're supposed to know exactly where we're going and what we're going to do on the earth plane. Why did they choose that? Well, you see, you don't know the physical reaction. When you see your procedure, you don't see the result of person's actions upon you spiritually because you're not yet imprisoned in an emotional body. You are witnessing that, as it were, with the freedom of your own spiritual identity. And it may well be that you've got to learn by this process now of experience, you've got to learn to protect yourself spiritually. So that if you are not able to, may I say, develop that part in yourself, and remember, all incarnations are not necessarily successful in the sense that they achieve the objective that they've come here so to do. So that you've got all these, may I call them, qualifications about various areas of thought that you cannot answer clearly in detail. This is because of that, that is because of that. It's rather like light. It merges this way and that way. And again, to the severity, I've quoted you severe cases. I've quoted you cases that have been horrific in the spiritual sense, just as the brutality is horrific on the physical level. But again, I emphasize, brutality on the physical level is far less damaging than this spiritual crucifixion that goes on day by day with thoughtless unkindness, with the dismissal of that person's feelings about this, the insensitivity of the reaction of that. But remember, it's not acquired by thoughtlessness, although that is very definitely something that one must cultivate, a careful, may I say, examination, that one is not being thoughtless. But when it's done deliberately, where it's done with that, it's rather like giving somebody a knife and cutting that body, as it were, deliberately, and making a very definite cut in the body. So these are the areas then that are most, may I say, most concerned, I think, I beg your pardon, our concern. Because these are the areas that you can do so much to obviate before you get here. You don't have to be a healer, dear ones, to know the pain of that particular situation. Just say to yourself, would I like somebody to say or do that to me? And think about that sort of action, rather than the obvious being kind and gentle and so on a purely physical level. I'm not intending in any way, dear ones, to preach about this, but you see, if I say to you that this is our widest field of healing and the most difficult in terms, again, of bringing about that spiritual equilibrium, then I think this is the real purpose behind our talk together this evening. Now, I'm quite sure that I've promoted all kinds of thoughts in your minds. Do please keep your questions as brief as you can, to the point, and I'll definitely deal with them to the best of my ability.
How does a period of dementia and associated confusion prior to passing affect spirit?
It doesn't. That's entirely physical, dear one, and it's a disorientation of spiritual energy on its physical level. And again, it could be spiritually directed towards the behavior and the cooperation and so on of people involved. You see, the essence of every experience, dear one, in a spiritual sense, has its purpose. But you see, the condition, this is what I'm saying, dear one, you've got to dismiss the circumstances on the physical level and come to the behind the why. Now, there's a great deal of research going into that area, isn't there? Many experimentations of cures and so on are taking place, aren't they? You understand me, do you want?
Yes, I do. Yes.
So you see, these could be the spiritual motive behind that. And while again I do emphasize it's very distressing on this physical level, but I can promise you in certain circumstances your spirit is entirely free from any kind of harm or distress as soon as that particular exercise has been completed. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Thank you.
Charles, I have a question about the spiritual crucifixion aspect. Is there anything that we can do on the earth plane to minimize the damage that comes about through that kind of action, the action of someone putting someone else down?
Here again, dear one, it does depend so much upon your own spiritual, may I say, point of progression, do you see? Because if you allow the emotional, can I call it condemnation of that, to overwhelm your own conviction, I am spirit here and now, and I have a power within myself that knows what I want to do and where I want to go if I allow it. You've got to shut the door on it, you see, dear one. So many times you entertain this kind of opinion, you see. I wonder if everybody thinks like that about me, and I've no idea, and so on. So you're fostering it, you're growing it, you see, and in so doing, dear one, you block what I call the spiritual energy that is going to disperse it.
Right.
But that must depend, as you can see, upon your own spiritual understanding.
Yes. Thank you.
Meditate, if we're talking about you, dear one, meditate immediately you can. I don't mean in any holier than thou way. I mean, come and shut the door on it. Now, I am a spirit now, and I have a power. You see, and while you're thinking that, you shut out the emotional intrusion. And the same display of energy, dear one, will give you what I call the impetus to take the next step. It may be take yourself out of the room. It may be, go or dismiss the person or people concerned. It will give you an action that you can obey, that dismisses, and that's the operative word. All you have, dear one, in spiritual terms, there's no success or failure. All you do is to do your best, and whatever people say to you, come inside and say, did I do my best about that? Did I do everything I knew about it? If you didn't, then be grateful that by that criticism, it's been, so to speak, revealed to you. Now you can do something about it. Or if it's totally untrue, you can dismiss it. You see, it's not allowing that to intrude upon your own spiritual now energy.
Yes,
That's the secret. I hope that helps.